Hi, my name is Pat, and this is my channel, Book Chat with Pat, and I'm glad that you're here. This week on Monday, January 20th, we observed Martin Luther King Day, and I thought that it would be appropriate to devote this episode of Poetry Thursday to his memory and to the poetry of social justice. I've selected poems from poets spanning about the last 57 years, starting in 1968, the year that King was murdered. And I've selected poems from 1968 up to the present day. So I'm going to get started right away because I have quite a few that I want to share. The first is from Muriel Rukeyser, and this poem was published in 1968. Poem, I lived in the first century of world wars. I lived in the first century of world wars. Most mornings I would be more or less insane. The newspapers would arrive with their careless stories. The news would pour out of various devices, interrupted by attempts to sell products to the unseen. I would call my friends on other devices. They would be more or less mad for similar reasons. Slowly, I would get to pen and paper, make my poems for others unseen and unborn. In the day, I would be reminded of those men and women, brave, setting up signals across vast distances, considering a nameless way of living, of almost unimagined values. As the lights darkened, as the lights of night brightened, we would try to imagine them, try to find each other, to construct peace, to make love, to reconcile waking with sleeping, ourselves with each other, ourselves with ourselves. We would try by any means to reach the limits of ourselves, to reach beyond ourselves, to let go the means, to wake. I lived in the first century of these wars. Caged Bird by Maya Angelou. A free bird leaps on the back of the wind and floats downstream till the current ends and dips his wing in the orange sun rays and dares to claim the sky. But a bird that stalks down his narrow cage can seldom see through his bars of rage. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still. And his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. The free bird thinks of another breeze, and the trade winds soft through the sighing trees, and the fat worms waiting on a dawn bright lawn, and he names the sky his own. But a caged bird stands on the grave of dreams. His shadow shouts on a nightmare scream. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. Making Peace by Denise Levertov. A voice from the dark called out, "The poet must give us imagination of peace to oust the intense, familiar imagination of disaster. Peace, not only the absence of war. But peace, like a poem, is not there ahead of itself, can't be imagined before it is made, can't be known except in the words of its making. Grammar of justice, syntax of mutual aid, a feeling towards it, dimly sensing a rhythm is all we have, until we begin to utter its metaphors, learning them as we speak. A line of peace might appear if we restructured the sentence our lives are making, revoked its reaffirmation of profit and power, questioned our needs, allowed long pauses. A cadence of peace might balance its weight on that different fulcrum. Peace, a presence, an energy field more intense than war, might pulse then, stanza by stanza, into the world, each act of living, one of its words, each word a vibration of light, facets of the forming crystal. Poem from 1995 from one of my favorite poets, Adrienne. What kind of times are these? There's a place between two stands of trees where the grass grows uphill and the old revolutionary road breaks off into shadows, near a meeting house abandoned by the persecuted who disappeared into those shadows. I've walked there picking mushrooms at the edge of dread. But don't be fooled. This isn't a Russian poem. This is not somewhere else, but here, our country moving closer to its own truth and dread, its own ways of making people disappear. I won't tell you where the place is, the dark mesh of the woods meeting the unmarked strip of light, ghost-ridden crossroads, leaf mold paradise. I know already who wants to buy it, sell it, make it disappear. And I won't tell you where it is. So why do I tell you anything? Because you still listen. Because in times like these, to have you listen at all, it's necessary to talk about trees. Next, I'd like to read a poem from 2013 by the poet Alicia Ostriker. And this is called Ghazal, America the Beautiful. And a ghazal is a particular kind of poem. It's a Persian poem that is written in a series of couplets, and each couplet ends with the same word. Do you remember our earnestness, our sincerity in first grade when we learned to sing America the Beautiful along with the Star-Spangled Banner and say the Pledge of Allegiance to America? We put our hands over our first grade hearts. We felt proud to be citizens of America. I said, one nation invisible until corrected. Maybe I was right about America. School days, dear old golden rule days, when we learned how to behave in America. What to wear, how to smoke, how to despise our parents who didn't understand us or America, only later learning the banner and the beautiful live on opposite sides of the street in America. Only later discovering the nation is divisible by money, by power, by color, by gender, by sex, America. We comprehend it now. This land is two lands, one triumphant bully, one still hopeful America. Imagining amber waves of grain blowing in the wind, purple mountains, and no homeless in America. Sometimes I will put my hand tenderly on my heart, somehow or other, still carried away by America. Next, I'd like to read a poem by Ross Gay from 2015. And this is a poem that he wrote after Eric Garner was killed by police officers while in custody. He was killed in a chokehold. And this is entitled A Small Needful Fact. A small needful fact is that Eric Garner worked for some time for the Parks and Rec horticultural department, which means perhaps that with his very large hands, perhaps in all likelihood, he put gently into the earth some plants, which most likely, some of them, in all likelihood, continue to grow, continue to do what such plants do, like house and feed small and necessary creatures, like being pleasant to touch and smell, like converting sunlight into food, like making it easier for us to breathe. Next, a poem from 2022 by Naomi Hobin, entitled Red Brocade. The Arabs used to say, when a stranger appears at your door, feed him for 3 days before asking who he is, where he's come from, where he's headed. That way, he'll have strength enough to answer. Or by then, you'll be such good friends, you don't care. Let's go back to that. Rice? Pine nuts? Here, take the red brocade pillow. My child will serve water to your horse. No, I was not busy when you came. I was not preparing to be busy. That's the armor everyone put on to pretend they had a purpose in the world. I refuse to be claimed. Your plate is waiting. We will snip fresh mint into your tea. And finally, I'm going to close with a poem entitled Rosa Parks by the great poet Nikki Giovani, who just passed away in December of 2024. Rosa Parks. This is for the Pullman porters who organized when people said they couldn't, and carried the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender to the Black Americans in the South so they would know they were not alone. This is for the Pullman porters who helped Thurgood Marshall go south and come back north to fight the fight that resulted in Brown versus Board of Education. Because even though Kansas is west, even though Topeka is the birthplace of Gwendolyn Brooks, who wrote The Powerful, the Chicago Defender sends a man to Little Rock. It was the Pullman porters who whispered to the traveling men, both the blues men and the race men, so that they both would know what was going on. This is for the Pullman porters who smiled as if they were happy and laughed like they were tickled when some folks were around, and who silently rejoiced in 1954 when the Supreme Court announced its 9-0 decision that separate is inherently unequal. This is for the Pullman porters who smiled and welcomed a 14-year-old boy onto their train in 1955. They noticed his slight limp that he tried to disguise with a doo-wop walk. They noticed his stutter and probably understood why his mother wanted him out of Chicago during the summer when school was out. 14-year-old black boys with limps and stutters are apt to try to prove themselves in dangerous ways when mothers aren't around to look after them. So this is for the Pullman porters who looked over that 14-year-old while the train rolled the reverse of the Blues Highway from Chicago to St. Louis to Memphis to Mississippi. This is for the men who kept him safe. And if Emmett Till had been able to stay on a train all summer, he would have maybe grown a bit of a paunch, certainly lost his hair, probably have worn bifocals and bounced his grandchildren on his knee, telling them about his summer riding the rails. But he had to get off the train and ended up in Money, Mississippi, and was horribly, brutally, inexcusably, and unacceptably murdered. This is for the Pullman porters who, when the sheriff was trying to get the body secretly buried, got Emmett's body on the northbound train, got his body home to Chicago, where his mother said, "I want the world to see what they did to my boy." And this is for all the mothers who cried. And this is for all the people who said, "Never again." And this is about Rosa Parks, whose feet were not so tired. It had been, after all, an ordinary day, until the bus driver gave her the opportunity to make history. This is about Mrs. Rosa Parks from Tuskegee, Alabama, who was also the field secretary of the NAACP. This is about the moment Rosa Parks shouldered her cross, put her worldly goods aside, was willing to sacrifice her life so that that young man in Money, Mississippi, who had been so well protected by the Pullman porters, would not have died in vain. When Mrs. Parks said no, a passionate movement was begun. No longer would there be a reliance on the law. There was a higher law. When Mrs. Parks brought that light of hers to expose the evil of the system, the sun came and rested on her shoulders, bringing the heat and the light of truth. Others would follow Mrs. Parks. 4 young men in Greensboro, North Carolina, would also say no. Great voices would be raised, singing the praises of God and exhorting us to forgive those who trespass against us. But it was the Pullman porters who safely got Emmett to his grand uncle, and it was Mrs. Rosa Parks who could not stand that death, and in not being able to stand it, she sat back down. As always, I thank you for watching. I hope that you're doing well. I'll speak with you again soon. Take care.